What if I told you that Pascal Laugier didn't just create a torture film, he accidentally made a modern grimoire that reveals secrets about death, transcendence, and what happens when you die? I'm not talking about movie theories here. I'm talking about real occult practices that have existed for thousands of years, ancient mystery schools that used torture to achieve enlightenment, and spiritual traditions that explain exactly what Anna saw in that final scene. Compiling research on esoteric philosophy, Gnostic texts, and mystical traditions, I found 10 spiritual secrets hidden in this film that will completely change how you see it. And here's the crazy part. Some of these practices are still happening today in secret societies around the world. The most shocking revelation. That final keep doubting line isn't mysterious at all when you understand ancient Gnostic teachings about the nature of reality itself. By the end of this video, you'll realize Laugier didn't just make entertainment, he created a spiritual teaching that most viewers aren't ready to understand. Secret 1. Real torture cults still exist. So here's something that'll mess with your head. The secret society in Martyrs is based on groups that actually existed and some that still do. The flagellants of medieval Europe, who believed that extreme physical suffering could break down the barriers between earth and heaven. The flagellants emerged during the Black Death in the 14th century, traveling from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public squares. They believed that by mimicking Christ's suffering, they could achieve direct communion with God and gain knowledge about salvation that regular prayer couldn't provide. These weren't isolated fanatics. They had organized hierarchies, wealthy patrons, and thousands of followers. But it gets darker. In early Christianity, there were sects called the Cainites who practiced ritual torture on willing participants to achieve what they called gnosis, or direct knowledge of God. According to the church father Irenaeus, who documented their practices in Against Heresies, the Cainites believed that normal prayer and meditation were for weaklings, and that only through extreme suffering could you force your soul to separate from your body and see divine truth. The Roman mystery religions took this even further. The cult of Mithras had initiation rituals that involved being buried alive, branded with hot irons, and subjected to psychological torture. The cult of Cybele required priests to castrate themselves in a frenzy of religious ecstasy. The survivors of these ordeals claimed they had died and been reborn with secret knowledge about what happens in the afterlife. Here's the disturbing part. Modern occult groups still practice versions of these rituals. The Ordo Templi Orientis, founded by Aleister Crowley, includes degrees of initiation that involve controlled suffering to induce transcendent states. There are documented cases of wealthy individuals funding private groups that use extreme physical and psychological stress to induce what they call transcendent experiences. The Society in Martyrs isn't fiction. It's based on real spiritual movements that view suffering as the ultimate path to enlightenment. Secret 2. The neurological gateway to the afterlife. Now, before you think this is all just ancient superstition, let me blow your mind with some science. Dr. Rick Strassman's research on DMT, the so-called spirit molecule, shows that extreme trauma can trigger the same neurological responses as near-death experiences. When the brain is subjected to intense physical stress, it releases massive amounts of endorphins, DMT, and other neurochemicals that create what researchers call dissociative transcendence. Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor documented this during her stroke, describing a sense of cosmic unity and direct spiritual knowledge that felt more real than ordinary consciousness. But here's where it gets occult. Many mystical traditions teach that these aren't just chemical hallucinations. Tibetan Buddhism describes states called bardo, where consciousness separates from the physical body and can access what they call the clear light of reality, pure knowledge unfiltered by physical limitations. The Tibetan practice of Chöd involves meditators visualizing being torn apart by demons to achieve ego death and cosmic consciousness. Advanced practitioners report leaving their bodies, communicating with non-physical entities, and receiving information about the nature of reality that they couldn't have known otherwise. Anna's transcendent state in the film matches exactly what these traditions describe, but with one crucial difference: she didn't choose her suffering. According to Tibetan teachings, this makes the experience far more dangerous and unpredictable. Forced transcendence can create what they call wrathful deities, aspects of traumatized consciousness that appear to offer knowledge but actually trap the soul in cycles of suffering. Secret 3. The ancient art of spiritual vampirism. This one's going to sound insane, but stay with me. The Society's method of extracting transcendent knowledge from their victims is based on a real occult practice called spiritual vampirism, or psychic parasitism, that's documented in grimoires going back centuries. In medieval texts like the Grimorium Verum and the Grand Grimoire, there are detailed instructions for what sorcerers called soul harvesting, rituals designed to steal the spiritual experiences of others. The idea is that when someone achieves transcendence through suffering, their consciousness expands beyond normal human limitations and can access cosmic knowledge that's normally hidden. But here's the twist. According to these texts, this expanded consciousness can be tapped into by others who know the right techniques. The process involves creating what occultists call a psychic link with someone in an altered state and literally siphoning off their transcendent experience. This practice shows up in multiple traditions. In certain branches of Tantra, there are warnings about practitioners who try to shortcut their spiritual development by feeding off the Enlightenment experiences of others. Vodou traditions describe stealing someone's T-bone ange, their higher soul, to gain spiritual power without doing the inner work. The society represents the ultimate corruption of spiritual seeking. Instead of doing the decades of meditation, study, and self-purification required for genuine transcendence, they're literally stealing it from their victims, their spiritual parasites masquerading as seekers of truth. Secret 4. The sacred geometry of torture. Okay, this is where things get really esoteric, but I'll break it down simply. The design of the torture chamber isn't random. It follows principles of sacred geometry that have been used in temple construction for thousands of years. Sacred geometry is based on mathematical ratios found throughout nature. The golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, geometric patterns that appear in everything from flower petals to galaxy spirals. Ancient architects used these ratios to design spaces that would elevate consciousness and connect people to divine harmony. Think about how you feel differently in a Gothic cathedral versus a strip mall. That's sacred geometry at work. The positioning of columns, the height of ceilings, the angles of light, all of this was calculated to create what architects called sacred space that would naturally induce spiritual states in the people inside. The great cathedrals of Europe, the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of ancient Greece, they all use these same mathematical principles. The society has weaponized these same principles. The positioning of the restraints, the lighting angles, even the room's proportions follow sacred geometric patterns, but they're designed to trap spiritual energy rather than channel it upward. In occult terms, they've created what's called a spiritual prison, a space that prevents the soul from escaping the body even during extreme trauma. Real practitioners of ritual magic use similar geometric principles in their temple designs, but for protection and empowerment. The society has corrupted these ancient techniques to create maximum spiritual suffering while keeping the consciousness locked in the physical body so they can extract information from it. It's like they've built a spiritual torture device using the same blueprints that mystics use to build temples. They understand the technology of sacred space, but they're using it for the exact opposite purpose it was intended for. Secret 5. The Gnostic heresy of forced enlightenment. Now we need to talk about Gnosticism because this is key to understanding what the film is really about. Gnostics were early Christians who believed that the physical world was created by a false god called the Demiurge, who traps souls in matter and feeds on their suffering. According to Gnostic texts like the Apocryphon of John and the Gospel of Thomas, true spiritual knowledge, gnosis, can only be achieved by breaking free from physical limitations and seeing reality as it truly is. But here's the crucial part that most people miss. This knowledge has to be freely chosen and spiritually earned through years of preparation, study, and inner purification. The Gnostics were very clear about this. Forced gnosis creates what they called archonic interference, negative spiritual entities that corrupt the knowledge and use it for evil purposes. The archons are described as parasitic beings that masquerade as divine messengers but actually feed on human suffering and spiritual confusion. The Society and Martyrs represents this exact heresy. They're trying to force transcendence through torture instead of achieving it through spiritual development. According to Gnostic teaching, this doesn't lead to enlightenment. It creates spiritual pollution that affects everyone involved and opens doorways to malevolent forces. This explains why everyone connected to the Society's activities ends up dead or destroyed. They're not accessing divine knowledge. They're opening doorways to what Gnostics called the realm of the archons, entities that appear to offer transcendent knowledge but actually trap souls in cycles of suffering and delusion. The Society thinks they're seeking truth, but they're actually serving the very forces that keep humanity spiritually enslaved. They've become unwitting agents of the Demiurge, harvesting spiritual energy through suffering and calling it enlightenment. Secret 6. The Buddhist Warning about violent transcendence. Buddhism has a lot to say about what happens when you try to force spiritual experiences through suffering, and none of it is good. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a detailed map of consciousness called the Bardo, teachings that describe what happens to awareness during the dying process and in the intermediate states between death and rebirth. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, more accurately called the Bardo Thodol, or Liberation Through Hearing in the Intermediate State, is essentially a guidebook for navigating these altered states of consciousness safely. It describes how properly prepared practitioners can maintain awareness during the dissolution of ordinary consciousness and use that awareness to achieve liberation. But the text also contains extensive warnings about what happens when someone enters these states through violence or trauma instead of proper spiritual preparation. According to these teachings, violent entry into the Bardo creates what are called wrathful deities, terrifying manifestations that appear to threaten and torment the consciousness. Here's the key insight. These wrathful deities aren't external demons. They're aspects of the traumatized psyche that have been given spiritual power through forced transcendence. They represent the consciousness's attempt to process extreme suffering, but without proper spiritual training, they become autonomous forces that trap the awareness in cycles of fear and confusion. Anna's experience mirrors this exactly. She achieves a transcendent state through extreme suffering, but instead of liberation, she becomes trapped in a spiritual prison where she can see ultimate reality but can't escape or properly communicate what she's learned. The knowledge she gains is real, but it's been corrupted by the violent method used to obtain it. The Buddhist warning is clear. Transcendence achieved through violence doesn't lead to enlightenment. It creates spiritual sickness that spreads to everyone who comes into contact with it. Secret 7, the Akashic Records and Cosmic Knowledge. Here's where we get into some really mind-bending territory. In esoteric philosophy, particularly in theosophy and Hindu mysticism, there's a concept called the Akashic Records, basically a cosmic library that contains all knowledge about past, present, and future. The word Akasha comes from Sanskrit and means sky or space, but in mystical contexts, it refers to a subtle substance that permeates all of reality and records every thought, action, and event that has ever occurred. Think of it as the universe's hard drive, storing every piece of information that has ever existed or ever will exist. Edgar Cayce, the famous American psychic known as the Sleeping Prophet, claimed to access these records during trance states. He described the experience as overwhelming and potentially dangerous for unprepared minds. According to Cayce, accessing cosmic knowledge without proper spiritual development was like trying to download the entire internet into a calculator. It would fry your circuits. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, wrote extensively about the Akashic Records in his book Cosmic Memory. He described them as accessible to anyone who had developed sufficient spiritual faculties, but warned that the knowledge gained had to be integrated gradually or it could cause psychological breakdown. Anna's whispered revelation to Mademoiselle might represent access to the Akashic Records, direct knowledge about the afterlife and the nature of reality that's normally hidden from human consciousness. This would explain why the information was so profound that it drove Mademoiselle to suicide. But here's the key insight from these traditions. This knowledge is supposed to be accessed gradually through spiritual development, meditation, and inner purification. When cosmic knowledge is obtained through violence and trauma, it becomes corrupted and dangerous. The information itself might be accurate, but the method of obtaining it poisons both the knowledge and the person receiving it. Secret 8. The guilt demon and spiritual attachment. Let's talk about Lucy's demonic tormentor, because this isn't just psychological trauma. It follows the exact pattern of what demonologists and spiritual traditions call entity attachment, or spiritual parasitism. In Christian demonology, as documented in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum and the works of exorcists like Father Gabriele Amorth, there are specific types of demons that attach to individuals who carry extreme guilt, shame, or trauma. These entities are described as feeding on negative emotions and self-destructive behavior, growing stronger every time their host engages in self-harm. The creature that torments Lucy, disfigured, self-harming, relentlessly attacking, matches descriptions from medieval grimoires of what are called guilt demons or shame spirits. These aren't metaphors. They're described as actual spiritual parasites that attach to people's energy fields and influence their thoughts and emotions. In Islamic tradition, these are called qareen, personal demons that every human is said to have, but which only gain power when someone is spiritually weakened by guilt, trauma, or despair. The Quran describes them as whispering destructive thoughts and encouraging self-harm and suicide. Tibetan Buddhism has a similar concept called hungry ghosts, beings trapped between life and death who are consumed by insatiable desires and feed on the negative emotions of living people. These entities are said to be created by extreme attachment, guilt, or unresolved trauma at the time of death. Lucy's inability to escape her tormentor, even after killing the people who hurt her, suggests a spiritual attachment rather than just psychological trauma. The demon isn't interested in justice or resolution. It's feeding on her guilt and self-hatred, growing stronger every time she hurts herself. According to these traditions, the only way to break free from such attachments is through spiritual purification, genuine forgiveness, and often the intervention of someone with spiritual authority. Lucy never achieves any of these things, which is why her suicide might represent the demon finally claiming her soul completely. Secret 9. The contagion of spiritual corruption. There's an occult principle that appears in multiple traditions called spiritual contagion. The idea that extreme spiritual experiences, especially traumatic ones, can spread to others through proximity, emotional connection, or psychic resonance. In Vodou tradition, this is called spiritual inheritance, when someone takes on the spiritual burdens of another person, often without realizing it. This can happen through deep emotional bonds, shared traumatic experiences, or even just prolonged exposure to someone who is spiritually afflicted. The concept appears in other traditions as well. In certain branches of Kabbalah, there are warnings about klippot, spiritual shells or husks that can attach to people who come into contact with corrupted spiritual energy. These shells are said to carry the imprint of traumatic experiences and can transfer from person to person like a psychic virus. Anna's decision to help Lucy clean up the murders might have transferred Lucy's spiritual contamination to her, making her the next target for the same demonic forces. This would explain why Anna ends up in the exact same situation as Lucy. Both become victims of forces that use their compassion and love against them. The Society's activities create this same kind of spiritual pollution on a massive scale. Every person they torture, every transcendent experience they steal, adds to a growing cloud of spiritual corruption that eventually consumes everyone involved. It's like a psychic plague that spreads through their network, destroying everyone it touches. This is why the film feels so hopeless. It's not just showing individual suffering, it's depicting the spread of spiritual sickness through an entire network of people who think they're seeking enlightenment, but are actually serving forces of destruction. The contagion spreads through what occultists call psychic links, energetic connections formed through shared experiences, emotional bonds, or even just witnessing extreme spiritual events. Once you're exposed to this kind of corrupted transcendence, you become vulnerable to the same forces that destroyed the original victims. Secret 10. The Silence of Ultimate Truth. Now we get to the big one, why Mademoiselle kills herself and what keep doubting really means. This connects to one of the most profound teachings in mystical traditions around the world, the idea that ultimate truth is literally impossible to communicate in human language. The Tao Te Ching begins with, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao." Hindu Advaita Vedanta teaches that Brahman, ultimate reality, is neti neti, not this, not that, meaning it transcends all human categories of thought and speech. Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart wrote about the divine darkness, a state of knowing that goes beyond all concepts and words. In Jewish Kabbalah, there's a concept called Ein Sof, the infinite divine reality that exists before and beyond all creation. The Zohar teaches that any attempt to describe Ein Sof necessarily diminishes and distorts it, because human language and concepts are finite while the divine is infinite. If Anna truly transcended human consciousness and accessed what these traditions call ultimate reality, that knowledge would be literally impossible to communicate to those still trapped in ordinary awareness. Any attempt to put it into words would necessarily corrupt and diminish it. But here's the deeper layer that most people miss. In Gnostic tradition, there's a teaching that ultimate truth about the nature of reality is so devastating to the human ego that most people would choose death rather than face it. The truth about consciousness, death, and what lies beyond physical existence might be so far removed from human assumptions that learning it would make continued existence unbearable. The Gnostic text, the Gospel of Truth, describes Gnosis as a terrifying beauty that simultaneously liberates and destroys the person who receives it. It's not that the truth is evil, it's that human consciousness, trapped in illusion and identification with the physical body, cannot survive contact with ultimate reality without being completely transformed or destroyed. Mademoiselle's keep doubting could be the only honest and compassionate response. Any attempt to share transcendent knowledge would corrupt it, turning divine truth into human concepts and ideas, and the knowledge itself might be too terrible for unprepared consciousness to bear. The silence protects both the truth and the people who aren't ready for it. Doubt keeps people searching, growing, and developing the spiritual capacity they would need to safely receive ultimate knowledge. Certainty, especially forced certainty obtained through violence, destroys both the seeker and the truth they think they've found. Maybe Anna's transcendence was real. Maybe it was a neurological response to trauma. Maybe it was an archonic deception designed to spread spiritual poison through the Society's network. The film doesn't give us enough information to know for certain, and that ambiguity might be the point. The only honest response to ultimate questions about consciousness, death, and transcendence is to keep doubting, keep seeking, and keep developing the spiritual discernment needed to tell the difference between genuine truth and sophisticated deception. Look, Martyrs isn't just a horror film, it's a spiritual teaching disguised as entertainment. These occult and esoteric themes run so deep that most viewers never realize they're watching a modern exploration of humanity's oldest questions about suffering, transcendence, and the nature of reality itself. Laugier didn't just create a movie about torture. He created a mirror that reflects back our own spiritual development and readiness for ultimate truth. Your reaction to the film reveals where you are on your own spiritual journey and what you're prepared to understand about the deeper mysteries of existence. But here's what I didn't tell you. There's one more layer to this film that connects it to real modern mystery schools and esoteric orders that still exist today. The techniques shown in the movie, the philosophical questions it raises, the spiritual dangers it depicts, they're all part of ongoing traditions that trace their lineage back thousands of years. If you want to know about the real-world spiritual practices that inspired crazy films like this one, subscribe to my channel for weekly videos. Keep doubting, and I'll see you in the next one.